Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So the year is 1568. The massive stone walls of the Chittorgarh Fort, which is perched high on a rocky plateau in Rajasthan, have been completely breached.
Right, after a brutal month-long siege.
Yeah, exactly. And the defending garrison has exhausted its rations, the ammunition is gone, and defeat against this vast imperial army waiting outside the gates is, well, it's an absolute mathematical certainty.
There is no way out at that point.
None. But the defending warriors, they don't surrender, because surrender just isn't in their vocabulary. Instead, the women of the fort dress in their finest bridal clothing and willingly march into a massive, roaring fire pit.
Which is an intense thing to visualize.
Very. And then the men, they bathe, they put on saffron-colored robes, which is the color of death and renunciation. They place a basil leaf in their mouths, throw open the heavy wooden gates, and just charge headlong into the besieging army.
Right, with the sole intention of dying in combat.
Yeah. No expectation of survival.
And, that event is really a crystallization of an entire worldview. I mean, you are looking at a society that placed abstract concepts like honor, purity, lineage far above biological survival or geopolitical pragmatism. It is the ultimate manifestation of the martial ethos of the Rajputs.
Which brings us to our mission today. We are going to unpack the origins, the dramatic rise, and the deeply complex cultural legacy of the Rajputs.
It's a massive topic.
It really is. So for you listening, we're doing a deep dive into the source material to trace the evolution of this sociocultural grouping of clans in the northern Indian subcontinent.
Right.
These are people who went from being disparate, nomadic, agro-pastoral communities to forging themselves into a highly formidable aristocratic warrior class.
And they fundamentally shaped the political landscape of South Asia from the 7th century well into the modern era.
We'll look at how the very meaning of the word Rajput shifted over time, right?
Yeah.
And the elaborate political myths they engineered to legitimize their power.
Yes, the myth-making is crucial.
Plus, their legendary resistance against invaders, and how they eventually integrated into the colossal machinery of the Mughal and British empires.
Because to really understand that journey, you have to peel back the layers of how historical identity is, well, manufactured.
Yeah.
We need to dissect the mechanics of their clan structures, analyze their battlefield tactics, which were often as rigid as they were courageous.
Very rigid.
And we also have to confront the severe social paradoxes that their quest for absolute purity created, especially regarding women.
So let's start right at the foundation with the term itself. If you ask a layperson today about the Rajputs, the immediate assumption is usually that they represent an unbroken, ancient caste of royalty stretching back to the dawn of Indian civilization.
Which makes sense because the etymology seems to back that up.
Right. The word comes from the Sanskrit Rajputra, which literally translates to son of a king. But when we actually look at the historical sources, they tell a completely different story about how that word was used back in the 7th century.
Yeah, the linguistic shift is really telling. When you examine early medieval texts, for instance, the Harshakarita, which was written by the court poet Banapada in the 7th century, the term Rajputra is not a genealogical label.
Okay, so it doesn't mean royal bloodline at that point?
No, not at all. It doesn't denote a specific hereditary bloodline or a closed caste. Instead, it functions much more like an administrative rank.
Or an occupational title, right?
Exactly. The texts use it to describe subordinate chieftains, elite mercenary cavalrymen, or local landholding magnates.
So basically in the 7th century, being a Rajputra was essentially a job description.
Pretty much.
It meant you had a certain degree of localized power, you had a horse, you had weapons, and that was regardless of who your ancestors were.
Right. I mean, you could be a mercenary who managed to secure a small fort and a few villages, and suddenly you held the title of Rajputra.
So the historical consensus firmly points away from a singular, monolithic, ancient aristocratic origin. The Rajputs didn't just emerge fully formed from the epic age.
No, their identity was a gradual construction. And to understand the catalyst for this, we have to look at the political climate following the decline of the Gupta Empire.
Specifically around the pivotal year of 647.
Yes, the death of Emperor Harsha.
Right. Harsha's death is really the inciting incident for centuries of massive geopolitical shifts. He had managed to briefly unite a vast portion of northern India.
But when he died without a clear successor, That massive centralized authority just shattered.
You suddenly have a colossal power vacuum stretching across the Gangetic Plains, the Aravalli Hills, and the Thar Desert. Trade routes become insecure, local administration collapses.
And well, nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. Into this fractured landscape stepped a massive variety of highly mobile, pastoral, and nomadic groups.
Who were these groups, specifically?
Well, the sources track the movements of communities like the Gurjaras, the Bills, the Jats, and the Raikas. You also have the descendants of foreign Central Asian invaders who had swept into the subcontinent generations earlier. Groups like the Hunas, or Hephthalites, who had gradually settled on the margins of society.
And these were tough, martial people. Many of them survived through cattle herding, which, in a lawless frontier often meant cattle rustling and localized skirmishing.
Right, you had to fight to keep your herd.
But as the centralized state disappeared, they found new opportunities. And this triggers the massive sociological phenomenon that scholars call Rajputization.
Rajputization, exactly.
These nomadic groups begin to transition into sedentary agrarian lifestyles. They claim tracts of land, establish fortified settlements, and start extracting revenue from local peasant populations.
But here's the catch. The transition from nomad to landlord requires a profound shift in social standing.
Because of the Varna system?
Yes. In the traditional Indian Varna system, the right to rule, to bear arms, and to collect taxes belongs exclusively to the Kshatriya class.
So, as these diverse pastoral groups and successful mercenaries amassed actual political and economic power, they faced a massive legitimacy problem.
Exactly. They had the swords and the land, but they lacked the traditional social sanction to be recognized as legitimate kings by the Brahmins and the broader populace.
I want to push back on the romanticized history here for a second. If we observe this mechanism, mercenaries and cattle herders seizing territory in a chaotic power vacuum and then suddenly calling themselves Rajaputras, the entire concept of the ancient Rajput bloodline starts to look like, well, a brilliant piece of medieval political fiction.
It really does.
It feels like an incredibly successful rebranding campaign. They reverse-engineered their ancestry to justify the land they had just conquered.
From an empirical genealogical perspective, you are hitting the nail on the head. The claim to an unbroken ancient Kshatriya bloodline was a deliberate mechanism of state formation.
It was a tool.
Yes. Dirk Kolff's research on early medieval India breaks down the concept of the military labor market perfectly.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Soldiering in this era was essentially a free market enterprise. A young man from a pastoral tribe could gather a band of followers, rent out his military services to a hired chieftain, accumulate wealth, conquer a small fiefdom, and establish a network of alliances.
So becoming a Rajput was really a process of upward mobility through martial success.
That's precisely what it was.
But the challenge with upward mobility in a deeply structured society is making it permanent. I mean, you can win a battle and take a castle today, but how do you ensure that 50 years from now, the local peasants still pay taxes to your grandson?
Right, and how do you make sure rival lords treat your family as equals?
Exactly. You can't just rely on military force forever. You need a compelling narrative. You need divine validation.
Which leads directly to the massive cultural engineering project of the early medieval period.
The mythic lineages.
Yes, the construction of the mythic lineages and the elaborate clan structures. The newly empowered warrior chiefs needed to sever their historical ties to their pastoral or foreign origins.
They needed to clean up their resume, so to speak.
Exactly. And to do this, they became massive patrons of specialized bardic communities, specifically groups like the Tirans and Bots.
Now, these bards weren't just entertainers strumming lutes in the corner, right?
No, they were the PR agents, the genealogists, and the official record keepers of the medieval world.
So a rising chieftain would commission a Chon to write an epic poem or forge a detailed genealogical tree that miraculously connected the chieftain's grandfather, not to a cattle herder, but directly to the legendary heroes of the Hindu epics, like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
That's right. And the bards categorized these diverse groups into three primary vanshas, or lineages.
Let's break those down.
First, you have the Suryavanshi, the solar descent. They trace their bloodline back to Surya, the sun god, and the epic hero Rama.
And this lineage was claimed by powerful clans like the Rathors of Marwar and the Sisodias of Mewar, correct?
Yes. Then you have the Chandravanshi, the lunar descent. They claimed lineage from Chandra, the moon god, and the god Krishna.
Which included clans like the Tomars and the Chandals.
Exactly. But the third lineage, the Agnivanshi or fireborn descent, is perhaps the most politically fascinating.
Oh, the Agnicula myth. That is a masterpiece of geopolitical
It
storytelling.
really is.
So the myth dictates that around the year 747, the moral order of the world, the Dharma, was under severe threat from demonic forces.
And the historical reality behind these demons usually refers to external Arab invaders or rival indigenous powers.
Right. So, to save the world, the great sages gathered at Mount Abu, which is a sacred peak in the Ara Valley Range. They performed a massive, legendary fire ceremony, a yajna. And out of this sacred fire pit, four fully armed warriors emerged to defend the earth.
And those four warriors became the progenitors of four major clans: the
Mm.
Chauhans, the Parmars, the Pratiharas, and the Solankis.
When you analyze the utility of this myth, it's brilliant. The Mount Abu ritual acted as a mechanism of ritual purification.
Absolutely. By claiming they were born directly from the sacred fire, these specific clans completely bypassed the need for a long, verifiable human genealogy
It scrubbed away any foreign or tribal origins instantly.
and replaced it with immaculate divine conception.
So, by institutionalizing these three overarching lineages, solar, lunar, and fire, the bards managed to organize a chaotic, sprawling mass of independent warlords into a coherent, structured social category.
Known as the 36 royal races.
But, a myth only works if people believe it and enforce it. You need a system to protect this newly minted aristocratic status from being diluted.
Which is where the concept of the Kuldevi, or the clan goddess, becomes the most crucial piece of the puzzle.
Right, because every single Rajput clan, or Kul, worshipped a specific protectress deity.
Yes. For the Chauhans, it was a Shapura Mata. For the Thoras, it was Naganeki Mata. The Kuldevi was the spiritual epicenter of the clan's identity.
Before any military campaign, the warriors sought her blessing. Her temples formed the geographic heart of their territory.
But beyond spiritual comfort, the Kuldevi served a highly practical, regulatory function. She was the ultimate enforcer of marriage laws.
I look at the Kuldevi system and the strict marriage rules, and it looks exactly like a complex medieval verification system.
That's a good way to put it.
It's like a cryptographic ledger for aristocratic blood. By intertwining deep religious devotion with these bardic genealogical records, the early Rajputs created a firewall around their identity.
Yeah, they locked it down.
If a rival mercenary group got wealthy and tried to just call themselves Rajputs to gain political legitimacy, they couldn't just forge a document. To truly enter the aristocracy, you had to marry into it.
And you could not marry into it without the religious sanction of the Kuldevi.
Let's talk about the mechanics of this marriage system, because they were incredibly strict.
Very strict. The Rajputs practiced endogamy at the macro level, meaning you had to marry someone who was also a recognized Rajput from the 36 royal races.
Okay, that keeps the wealth and status within the broad group.
Right. But they practiced absolute exogamy at the micro level, meaning you could, under no circumstances, marry someone from your own kul, your own clan.
So you could not marry another Chahan if you were a Cha.
Exactly. The Kuldevi sanctioned these inter-clan marriages, and this created a highly regulated, dense web of political and marital alliances stretching across northern and western India.
It bound rival, fiercely independent families into a massive collaborative leadership network. I mean, you might be fighting the neighboring clan over a border dispute on Tuesday, but your sister is married to their chief.
Right, and you both worship at the same tier of the caste system.
So, armed with this divine validation, backed by the genealogical records of the bards, and organized through the strict marital structure, these warrior lineages were now fully equipped to transition from local warlords into massive empire builders.
And this transition marks the 8th through the 12th centuries. It's an era where the Rajputs consolidate their power and really become the undisputed masters of the South Asian political stage.
The prime example of this early imperial success is the Gujar-Pratihara dynasty.
The Pratiharas were an absolute powerhouse. Under the rule of Mihira Bhoja, whose reign spanned from 836 to 885, they pushed their borders outward.
They created an empire covering vast swaths of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and the Malwa Plateau.
And the sources highlight their military capacities, specifically their role in halting the eastward expansion of Arab armies pushing in from Sindh.
Right. Mihira Gorja commanded an immense cavalry force. But to understand Rajput power, we have to look past the borders on a map and examine the actual mechanism of their governance.
Because they did not build a highly centralized, bureaucratic, autocratic state like the Mauryas had done centuries before.
Or like the Mughals would do later.
Right. The Rajput political model was intensely decentralized. It operated on a feudal mechanism known as Bhai-band.
Which translates to brotherhood. Let's break down how Bhai-band actually functioned on the ground. The kingdom wasn't viewed as the personal exclusive property of the king, right?
No, it was the joint property of the entire ruling clan. The king, or the Raja, was essentially just the first among equals.
So how did they distribute the land?
The mechanism relied on land grants, called jagirs. The king would grant control of a specific territory, a collection of villages, and perhaps a hilltop fort to his vassals.
And these vassals were almost always his kinsmen, his brothers, uncles, cousins.
Exactly. And in exchange for the right to collect agricultural revenue from that jagir, the vassal was bound by blood and honor to maintain a specific number of armed cavalrymen.
And present them for military service whenever the king called for them.
Yes.
You can see the immediate tactical benefits of this. If a neighboring kingdom raids your border, the local vassal doesn't have to wait for a messenger to ride 3 weeks to the capital, get a bureaucratic stamp of approval, and wait for a royal army to march back.
No, the local lord already has his cavalry raised, armed, and ready to respond in an afternoon.
Furthermore, it allowed the local peasant villages a high degree of autonomy. They were governed by their local panchayats or councils, handling their own day-to-day affairs so long as they paid the harvest tax to the local Rajput lord.
It rooted the military power directly into the agrarian landscape. It created a society optimized for localized defense and resilience.
But there is a massive but here. As the Pratihara Empire declined in the 10th century, the inherent flaws in the Bhai-band system became painfully obvious.
Yes, the empire fractured along clan lines into powerful regional strongholds.
The Chauhans fortified Ajmer. The Chandelas dominated the rugged terrain of Bundelkhand.
And the Solankis took over Gujarat, utilizing the wealth of maritime trade networks in the Arabian Sea to fund their armies.
The fragmentation highlights the fatal strategic flaw of the Bhai-band system. If you treat your kingdom as a loose confederation of heavily armed peasants, you foster fierce local loyalty, sure, but you sacrifice grand strategy.
Completely. You're dealing with clan chiefs who are hypersensitive to their own honor, their own territorial borders, and their own independence.
If the king asks a vassal to march to a distant frontier, the vassal might just refuse if he feels slighted, or if he's too busy fighting a blood feud with the vassal next door over a marriage dispute.
Which happened constantly. The decentralization meant they were perpetually engaged in internecine warfare. They were bleeding each other dry over pride and small strips of land.
They structurally lacked the capacity to form a permanent united front.
And that inability to unify would soon become an existential crisis, as the Rajput kingdoms found themselves directly in the path of expanding Islamic empires, pushing through the mountain passes from Central Asia.
Which brings us to the late 12th century and one of the most consequential military encounters in South Asian history, the Ghurid invasions. Let's examine the mechanism of the battles of Turin.
The conflict at Turin really represents a clash of two entirely different military doctrines. In 1191, Muhammad of Ghor led a massive Turkic army into northern India,
And he was met at Turin by Prithviraj Chauhan III.
who had achieved something incredibly rare. He had managed to assemble a significant coalition of rival Rajput forces to face the external threat.
And in this first battle of Turin, the Rajput military machine worked perfectly. Prithviraj utilized superior archery and heavy cavalry charges to break the Ghurid lines.
Muhammad of Ghor was severely wounded, his army routed, and he was forced to retreat back to Afghanistan.
So the Rajputs celebrated a massive victory, but they didn't pursue the retreating army to finish them off.
No, they allowed them to leave, adhering to their own chivalric codes of battlefield conduct.
And that proved fatal, because just 1 year later, in 1192, Muhammad of Ghor returned. The Second Battle of Turin took place on the exact same field, but the Ghurids changed their tactics entirely.
Muhammad of Ghor realized he could not break the Rajput heavy cavalry in a frontal clash.
Right.
So he utilized highly mobile mounted archers and deployed the classic Central Asian steppe tactic, the feigned retreat.
He divided his forces and sent waves of light cavalry to harass the Rajput flanks with arrows.
And when the heavily armored Rajputs lost their patience and charged, the Ghurid cavalry simply melted away, galloping out of reach.
Forcing the Rajputs to chase them under the hot Indian sun.
Exactly. They exhausted the Rajput horses and broke their disciplined formations. Once the Rajput lines were stretched thin and tired, the Ghurids wheeled around with their fresh, heavy cavalry reserves and shattered them.
Prithviraj Chauhan was captured and executed. The Rajput coalition dissolved.
The fallout from the Second Battle of Tarain was absolute. It dismantled the preeminent Rajput power structure in the north and permanently opened the gates of the Gangetic Plain to foreign conquest.
It laid the direct foundation for the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. The political center of gravity shifted away from the Rajput clans.
But military defeat didn't erase them. Instead of submitting, the surviving clans retreated to their desert strongholds and rugged hills, initiating centuries of ferocious, almost unimaginable resistance.
To understand the sheer scale of this resistance, let's fast forward to 1527 and look at Rana Sanga of Mewar.
A truly legendary figure.
This is a man who, according to the sources, had lost an arm, an eye, and had his leg crippled in previous battles. Yet he manages to pull together an army of an estimated 100,000 Rajput troops to face Babu, the founder of the Mughal Empire, at the Battle of Kanwa.
Rana Sanga embodies the unyielding Rajput warrior ethos. He clearly understood the existential threat that Babur's invasion posed, and he managed to temporarily suppress the internal clan feuds to form a massive confederacy.
But at Kanwa, the Rajput army collided with a technological revolution they were completely unprepared for.
Gunpowder.
Yes. Babur brought field artillery to the subcontinent. He brought cast bronze cannons and matchlock muskets.
And the logistical setup Babur used was devastating. He chained heavy wooden carts, called araba, together in a long line across the battlefield to break the momentum of a cavalry charge.
He placed his artillery and musketeers behind this fortified wall. The Rajput military doctrine, meanwhile, had remained relatively static. It relied almost entirely on the psychological shock value of war elephants and massive, densely packed frontal cavalry charges.
So when Rana Sanga ordered the charge at Kanwa, the results were catastrophic.
The Rajput cavalry hit the barricade of chained carts and stalled.
Then the Mughal artillery opened fire. The deafening roar of the cannons and the smoke of the matchlocks terrified the Rajput war elephants.
Because elephants are highly intelligent but easily panicked by unfamiliar explosive sounds.
Right. The beasts turned around and bolted back through their own lines, trampling thousands of Rajput soldiers.
And then Babur's forces utilized flanking maneuvers with mounted archers to encircle the remnants. The Rajput army was basically annihilated. Watching this happen, observing this tactical rigidity, you have to ask a blunt question.
What's that?
Why did Rajput leaders continue to rely on frontal cavalry charges and war elephants after witnessing the devastating effectiveness of mobile archery at Tarain and gunpowder at Kanwa?
It's a fair question.
From an objective military science perspective, their strict adherence to chivalric ideals, fighting face-to-face, rejecting deceit, relying on heavy swords against cannons, became a massive military liability. They sacrificed geopolitical survival on the altar of personal honor.
And that is the central critique historians levy against Rajput military strategy. Their failure to adapt to gunpowder technology and mobile tactics cost them their independence.
So why didn't they adapt?
To understand that, you have to understand the internal logic of the Rajput Dharma, their code of conduct. Within their cultural paradigm, winning a battle through deceit, using a feigned retreat, or attacking at night was viewed as a profound moral failure.
Right. To a Rajput, how you fought was just as important, if not more so, than the outcome of the battle.
Exactly. Honor was a tangible currency. If you abandoned the code of honor to win a battle, you abandoned the very essence of what made you a Rajput. You suffered a social and spiritual death that was considered far worse than physical death on a battlefield.
Nowhere is this terrifying commitment to honor more visceral than in the sieges of their great hill forts, particularly Chittorgarh, which we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Chittorgarh is the prime example. The fort was besieged 3 major times, first in 1303 by the Sultan of Delhi, Alauddin Khilji, then in 1534 by Bahadur Shah of Gujarat, and finally in 1568 by the Mughal Emperor Akbar.
And in each instance, the Rajput garrison fought until the walls were breached and the food was gone. When military defeat was inevitable, they enacted the twin rituals of Jauhar and Saka.
These practices are the horrifying logical conclusion of a society that views surrender as a fate worse than death.
Let's unpack the Jauhar first.
Jauhar was the mass self-immolation of the women and children. The queens, princesses, and noblewomen understood that capture meant enslavement, forced conversion, and the absolute destruction of their purity and the clan's honor.
So they would dress in their wedding finery, perform religious rites, and voluntarily walk into massive, roaring fire pits constructed within the inner courtyards of the fort.
And while the women burned, the men prepared for the Saka.
The final suicidal charge.
Yes. The warriors would bathe, put on saffron robes to signify that they had severed all ties to the mortal world, consume a tulsi leaf, and perform their final prayers. Then they would throw open the gates of the fort and charge headlong into the thousands of besieging troops.
The objective of the Saka was not to win. It was a fight with no return. The singular goal was to inflict maximum casualties on the enemy before inevitably being cut down.
The fires of Jauhar and the blood of the Saka were mechanisms designed to preserve their moral victory for eternity.
It ensured that even in absolute military annihilation, the enemy conquered nothing but ashes and corpses.
But as you can imagine, engaging in mass suicide every time a larger empire attacks is not a viable strategy for long-term survival.
Well, entire lineages were being wiped out. Some Rajput leaders recognized that if their people and their culture were going to survive in a world dominated by gunpowder empires, they had to adapt.
They had to pivot from absolute resistance to strategic integration.
Which leads us directly to the profound and complex symbiosis with the Mughal Empire.
The shift from eternal warfare to political partnership was largely engineered by the third Mughal emperor, Akbar, in the mid-16th century.
Akbar was a brilliant pragmatist.
Highly pragmatic. He realized that trying to permanently conquer, hold, and extract revenue from the harsh deserts and rugged hills of Rajasthan against a population willing to burn themselves alive rather than submit was a logistical and financial nightmare.
It was just bleeding his empire's resources. So Akbar changed the paradigm. Instead of demanding their destruction, he offered them a seat at the table. He invited them to join the imperial power structure.
Akbar leveraged the Mansabdari system, which was the bureaucratic and military framework of the Mughal nobility. It was a highly structured numeric ranking system.
How did that apply to the Rajput kings?
Well, if a Rajput ruler agreed to submit to Mughal suzerainty, Akbar allowed them to retain absolute control over their ancestral lands, which were classified as Wadan Jagirs.
So they get to keep their home turf.
Exactly. And in addition, he granted them a mansab, a rank, which dictated their salary and the number of cavalry they were required to maintain for the Mughal army.
This elevated the Rajput kings from regional warlords to high-ranking generals and administrators within the wealthiest empire on earth.
And the integration went far beyond signing a treaty. It became deeply biological.
To cement these alliances, Akbar initiated a series of matrimonial pacts. He married Rajput princesses from prominent clans, most notably the Kachwahas of the Kingdom of Amber.
This fundamentally altered the genetic makeup of the Mughal dynasty. The subsequent Mughal emperors, men like Jahangir and Shah Jahan, had significant Rajput ancestry.
I mean, Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, was actually three-quarters Rajput by blood.
Yes, and the cultural exchange that flowed from these marriages was immense. Rajput mothers and wives within the imperial harem imparted their religious traditions, their dietary customs, and their artistic sensibilities to the Mughal heirs.
Simultaneously, Rajput rulers and their retinues spent vast amounts of time at the cosmopolitan Mughal courts in Agra and Delhi.
They absorbed Persian administrative techniques, courtly etiquette, and architectural styles, bringing them back to their own capitals in Rajasthan.
Militarily, this partnership was the engine of Mughal expansion. Rajput generals commanded vast imperial armies. Look at the career of Raja Man Singh, the first of Amber.
He became one of Akbar's highest-ranking and most trusted commanders.
Man Singh led Mughal forces thousands of miles from his home desert to conquer and secure massive, wealthy territories like Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa for the Mughal crown.
The Mughals were essentially using Rajput swords to expand their borders across the subcontinent.
It was a highly successful symbiotic relationship, but we must contrast this assimilation with those who violently rejected it.
Because the spirit of the Saka did not vanish.
Not at all. The most iconic figure of Rajput resistance during this era is Maharana Pratap Singh I, the ruler of the Sisodia clan of Mewar. While other clans were giving their daughters to the Mughal court and accepting titles, Maharana Pratap outright refused to submit to Akbar.
Maharana Pratap is a towering legendary figure. In 1576, his defiance culminated in the Battle of Haldigati.
And he faced a massive Mughal army, which, in a bitter irony of the era, was commanded by his fellow Rajput, Raja Man Singh.
But Pratap had learned from the disaster of Kanwa. He didn't assemble his men on an open plain to be slaughtered by Mughal cannons.
No, Pratap utilized the geography of Mewar to his advantage. He drew the Mughal forces into the narrow, rugged passes of the Aravalli Hills at Haldigati.
And that terrain negated the Mughal advantage in numbers and heavy artillery.
Furthermore, Pratap forged alliances with the indigenous Bhil tribes of the region, utilizing their expertise in archery and intimate knowledge of the terrain to launch devastating guerrilla attacks.
While the Mughals technically won the field at Haldigati, forcing Pratap to retreat, it was a massive strategic and moral victory for Muir.
Pratap didn't surrender. He vanished into the hills and spent the rest of his life waging a relentless guerrilla war of attrition against the Mughals.
He slowly reclaimed his territory fort by fort, famously vowing never to sleep on a bed or eat from silver plates until his capital of Chittagong was fully restored.
He became the enduring symbol of uncompromised Rajput independence.
So you have this intense duality within the Rajput identity during the Mughal era. You have Man Singh expanding the empire from within, draped in imperial wealth, and you have Pratap fighting it from the harsh wilderness, draped in ideological purity.
And this delicate balance of imperial service and regional pride worked remarkably well for over a century. But the symbiosis eventually fractured.
And the catalyst for that fracture was the Emperor Aurangzeb.
Right. Aurangzeb was a fundamentalist who reversed the inclusive, syncretic policies established by Akbar.
He alienated his most crucial military allies. He reimposed the jizya, a tax levied specifically on non-Muslim subjects, which deeply offended the Rajput nobility.
He also ordered the destruction of several prominent Hindu temples. And most disastrously, he began interfering directly in the succession disputes of major Rajput states, attempting to assert direct imperial control over kingdoms like Marwar.
Aurangzeb's overreach sparked a massive conflagration. The Rathore Rebellion ignited in 1679 and raged relentlessly until Aurangzeb's death in 1707.
For nearly 30 years, the Rajputs reverted to their ancestral tactics, fighting a brutal war of attrition against the Mughal state.
This conflict drained massive amounts of Mughal military manpower and financial resources. Combined with Aurangzeb's equally disastrous wars against the Marathas in the south, this continuous bleeding in Rajasthan directly accelerated the structural collapse of the Mughal Empire.
When you step back and look at the entirety of the Rajput-Mughal dynamic, it operates very much like a modern corporate acquisition.
How so?
Well, you have a massive parent corporation, the Mughals, acquiring a highly specialized, fiercely independent regional firm, the Rajputs. But the culture of the acquired entity is so potent that it deeply infiltrates the parent organization.
That's a great analogy.
Because of the extensive biological intermarriage, the heavy reliance on Rajput generals for imperial conquest, and the deep fusion of art and architecture, it's hard to separate the two. A massive portion of what we casually label Mughal culture and military ethos was actually heavily Rajput in origin.
The boundaries between the two civilizations blurred significantly. The military culture of the later Mughal army was heavily saturated with Rajput codes of valor and honor.
And culturally, the synthesis produced an absolute zenith in North Indian civilization, which leads us to the fact that the Rajputs were not just soldiers locked in an endless cycle of sieges and cavalry charges.
No, they were some of the most prolific builders and patrons of art in the history of the subcontinent.
The scale of their architectural legacy is staggering. Because the Mansabdari system guaranteed their land revenue and flooded their treasuries with imperial salaries, they channeled immense wealth into monumental constructions.
Going back to the 10th and 11th centuries, you have the Chandelas constructing the magnificent Khajuraho temples, which are universally famous for their soaring spires and their incredibly intricate, often explicit sculptural work.
And in Rajasthan, you see the evolution of the palace fortress. These structures reflect the dual nature of their society.
Like Kumalgarh, with walls thick enough to run multiple horses abreast.
Or the Marangar fort, towering imposingly over the blue city of Jodhpur. From the outside, they are impregnable military garrisons designed to withstand artillery sieges.
But step inside, and they are sprawling, opulent centers of courtly life, featuring delicate stone latticework, pleasure gardens, and lavishly decorated durbar halls.
Within the walls of those opulent palaces, we have to examine the social fabric of the Rajputs, particularly the deeply complex and often paradoxical role and status of women.
Yes, this is crucial. When you read the historical sources, you are confronted with massive contradictions regarding gender.
The paradox is profound. On one hand, the historical records and bardic traditions portray Rajput women, especially within the nobility, as commanding immense respect.
They were frequently educated in literature and administration. There are numerous accounts of queens acting as powerful regents for underage sons, managing the estates, advising on military strategy, and even occasionally participating in hunts or defending fortresses when the men were absent.
And the ancient practice of Swayamvar historically allowed a royal princess a degree of agency. enabling her to choose her own husband from an assembly of invited suitors.
Right. You have this strong tradition of venerating female power. Their most sacred deities are the fierce, martial, cool, divas goddesses of war and protection.
Yet, as the Rajput identity solidified over the centuries, and as the political pressure to maintain land, wealth, and extreme caste purity intensified, the societal rules imposed upon mortal women became increasingly rigid and brutal.
The freedom suggested by early epics was overshadowed by severe patriarchal constraints. To understand why this happened, we must examine the mechanics of hypergamy.
Which is a social rule dictating that a woman must marry a man of equal or higher social status.
Yes. And in the highly stratified clan hierarchy of the Rajputs, this created a massive bottleneck.
The math behind hypergamy is brutal. If you are a lower-tier Rajput chief, you desperately want to marry your daughter into a higher-tier clan to elevate your family's political standing.
But the higher-tier families know they hold the monopoly on status, so they demand exorbitant, ruinous dowries in exchange for accepting the bride.
The dowry system became a crippling economic burden. If a chief had multiple daughters, finding suitable matches higher up the ladder could literally bankrupt the estate.
Furthermore, leaving a daughter unmarried was considered a profound stain on the clan's honor. Tragically, this terrifying economic reality led to the widespread practice of female infanticide in certain regions.
It emerged as a grim, pragmatic solution to avoid the insurmountable debt and the perceived loss of honor associated with being unable to secure a hypergamous match.
And the constraints didn't end with marriage. The obsession with purity and honor led to the strict enforcement of child marriage to secure alliances early.
The prohibition of widow remarriage was absolute. A widow was expected to live a life of severe austerity.
And most horrifyingly, you see the entrenchment of sati, the practice where a widow voluntarily, or sometimes under immense social coercion, immolates herself on her husband's funeral pyre.
Now, to modern sensibilities, the cognitive dissonance is staggering. How does a society worship a fierce warrior goddess while systematically practicing female infanticide and sati?
Within their ideological framework, the harsh constraints were justified as the ultimate mechanisms of protection. The honor of the entire clan was believed to reside directly in the purity, chastity, and sacrifice of its women.
So controlling women's lives and controlling their deaths was viewed by the patriarchal structure not as oppression, but as the paramount defense of the clan's spiritual and social standing in a chaotic world.
It is a heavy, deeply sobering reality to process. This was a society capable of immense violence, both externally on the battlefield and internally within its own social structures.
But alongside that rigidity, there was also a remarkable explosion of color, devotion, and creativity. I want to highlight the Rajput miniature painting style.
The miniature paintings perfectly encapsulate the cultural synthesis of the era. Flourishing under the influence of Mughal ateliers, the various Rajput courts like Mewar, Marwar, Kishangar, and Bundi developed distinct, highly refined painting schools.
These works are characterized by vivid, bold colors, meticulous microscopic detailing, and a distinct aesthetic philosophy.
While Mughal art often focused heavily on realistic portraiture and chronicling historical events, the Rajput miniatures drew heavily from the emotional and spiritual world.
They illustrated Hindu mythology, the romantic and divine life of the god Krishna, the Ragamala, which were visual depictions of musical modes and highly stylized scenes of courtly life, hunting, and monsoon landscapes.
They are visually stunning testaments to a society that deeply valued aesthetics, poetry, and religious devotion.
But the luxury and stability that funded those artists began to crumble in the 18th century. As the central authority of the Mughal Empire rapidly waned following the death of Aurangzeb, the Rajput states found themselves exposed.
They faced an entirely new, incredibly aggressive power, expanding rapidly from the south, the Maratha Empire.
The 18th century was a period of severe vulnerability and humiliation for the Rajputs. The Maratha incursions were devastating.
The sources describe decades of relentless raids. The Marathas were highly mobile light cavalrymen who specialized in rapid strikes.
They subjected the Rajput states to massive financial extortion, demanding taxes known as chauth and sardashmuki. If the Rajputs didn't pay, the Marathas plundered their territories, burned their crops, and besieged their cities.
And the decentralized nature of the Rajput clans, which we discussed earlier, returned to haunt them. After generations of either fighting the Mughals or comfortably serving within their imperial bureaucracy, the Rajput kings were too busy squabbling over internal succession disputes to form a cohesive, unified defense against the Maratha war machine.
Their heavy cavalry and static forts were largely ineffective against the Maratha guerrilla tactics.
Desperate to escape the crushing financial ruin and military harassment of the Marathas, the Rajput kingdoms began looking for a new, paramount power to protect them.
And they found that power in the rapidly expanding British East India Company. In the early 19th century, primarily around 1818, the various Rajput states entered into a series of subsidiary alliances and treaties with the British.
We must analyze the mechanics of these British treaties, as they fundamentally altered the trajectory of Rajput history.
The British established a system of indirect rule, creating what became known as the princely states.
Under the terms of these treaties, the Rajput rulers surrendered their external sovereignty. They gave up the right to wage war, form alliances, or conduct foreign policy.
In exchange, the British East India Company guaranteed their borders against external threats, namely the Marathas, and promised to protect the kings from internal rebellions.
The British placed a resident, a British political officer, in each Rajput court. The resident technically only offered advice, but in reality, they controlled the major levers of power, manipulating succession, controlling the finances, and ensuring absolute loyalty to the British crown.
The Rajput rulers were allowed to maintain their grand titles, their palaces, their internal wealth, and a degree of local administrative autonomy within their borders, as long as they didn't cross the resident.
It was a Faustian bargain. They traded their historical independence for guaranteed security. By propping up the Maharajas with British military backing, the treaties insulated the rulers from the natural consequences of bad governance.
If a Rajput king taxed his peasants too heavily in the past, he risked a rebellion that could overthrow him. Now, British guns ensured he stayed on the throne regardless of how he ruled.
I look at this policy of indirect rule, and it functioned as a massive geopolitical preservation tactic. By freezing the borders and insulating the rulers, the British effectively froze the Rajputs in time.
For centuries, the Rajput identity was forged in the crucible of warfare, social mobility, and territorial expansion. The British stripped away their true geopolitical utility. They turned a dynamic, constantly evolving, sword-wielding warrior class into ceremonial museum pieces of the British Raj.
That is a highly accurate assessment of the colonial era. Without the constant state of warfare that had defined their existence, the Rajput aristocracy turned inward.
They redirected their martial energies into extravagant displays of wealth and ceremonial pageantry. They built massive European-style palaces alongside their ancient forts.
They became obsessed with polo, lavish tiger hunts, and attending imperial durbars draped in jewels to prove their loyalty to the British monarch.
And the British actively encouraged this. Colonial administrators, most famously James Todd, who served as a political agent in Rajasthan, wrote extensively about the Rajputs.
Todd heavily romanticized them, framing them as the noble savages or the chivalric knights of India, drawing direct parallels to European feudalism.
He documented their myths and histories in a way that flattered their pride while reinforcing their subservient status within the empire. They became caricatures of their own glorious past.
However, the martial legacy did not completely evaporate into ceremonial pomp. The British military establishment deeply respected the historical fighting qualities of the Rajputs.
They categorized them under the pseudo-scientific theory of the martial races, viewing them as biologically and culturally predisposed to warfare. The British heavily recruited Rajput peasants and minor nobles into the British Indian Army.
This provided a massive new avenue for military employment. Rajput regiments fought in major conflicts across the globe serving the British Empire, from the trenches of World War I to the deserts of North Africa and World War II.
They were no longer fighting for their clan chiefs or their local forts, but they were continuing the ancient occupational tradition of selling their military labor.
This brings us to the monumental political shifts of the mid-20th century. In 1947, the subcontinent achieved independence from British rule, leading to the creation of the modern democratic nations of India and Pakistan.
This event signaled the absolute end of the era of the Maharajas. The new independent Indian government, led by figures like Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, undertook the massive task of integrating the hundreds of princely states into the Democratic Republic.
The Rajput rulers were forced to sign instruments of accession, permanently surrendering their ruling powers.
In exchange, they were initially granted privy purses, tax-free stipends from the government, and allowed to keep their personal properties and titles. But eventually, even those privileges were abolished in the 1970s.
The transition from absolute monarchs to democratic citizens was a profound shock to the system. The grand palaces were converted into heritage hotels or museums. The royal families had to adapt to running businesses or entering democratic politics to maintain their influence.
Yet, despite the complete dismantling of their political authority, the identity persists robustly across the subcontinent today.
The sources emphasize the continued presence of a distinct Rajput identity in both modern India and Pakistan. The cultural memory is incredibly long.
The reverence for the ancestors who fought at Chittorgarh or Haldigati remains a potent force, and the martial legacy explicitly continues through elite military units. The Rajput regiment of the modern Indian Army continues to trace its lineage and its regimental pride back through centuries of conflict, maintaining the ethos of their forebears.
It's a profound study in how a society adapts to survive the grinding wheel of history. They have endured massive shifts in technology, religion, and governance over a millennium, constantly renegotiating their place in the world while fiercely guarding the core of their identity.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with as we wrap up this deep dive. Think about the sheer breathtaking malleability of human identity we have just explored.
Right.
The Rajputs began as fluid, mobile, pastoral laborers and mercenaries. They were tough people looking for an opportunity in a chaotic world after an empire collapsed. Yet, through the immense power of shared myth, the deliberate engineering of genealogies by bards, and an uncompromising, terrifying dedication to martial honor, they forged themselves into an aristocratic bloodline so unyielding, so completely real to them, that thousands willingly marched into raging fires and onto the cannons of their enemies rather than betray it.
It's incredible.
It asks you to look at the world around you and ponder how many of the ancient, seemingly rigid traditions, identities, and sacred bloodlines we see today actually began centuries ago as acts of brilliant, pragmatic, political invention.
That tension between historical fact and the power of belief is what shapes the world.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.